The best story I can tell you to illustrate the power of a mindset and what it has to do with our ability to produce results is a story I first heard from Bob Harris, who is a coach. I don't even know if he's still around. I used to follow him in the 80s when I was a student, and I got some tapes, cassette tapes, and I used to listen to them. And I'll never forget this story because it's so powerful. He says that, it's a fictional story. He says that this guy had a factory. He made shoes, and he was looking at a map of the world, and he decided that, to send some salespeople to Africa. This is how I remember him telling the story. And from nowadays, from our modern perspective, it may seem like a little bit of a questionable story, but back in the 80s was a good story, right? So he's looking at Africa and decides to send 2 salespeople to Africa and to 2 different parts of Africa. And he decides to ship 1 container filled with shoes to each one of those areas, and the salesperson would get there, and in a couple of weeks the container would come in by ship, and the salesperson would have enough shoes to sell. So he says that the first salesperson arrives in Africa, looks around, calls back at the factory and tells the boss, hey, listen, cancel the shipment because nobody here wears shoes. So cancel the shipment. I'm packing up and going back home. Don't send me any shoes. Nobody here wears shoes. The second salesperson in a different part of the continent looks around, calls the factory and says, listen, double the shipment because nobody here wears shoes, so I need way more because I'm going to sell a ton of shoes here. So I know that nowadays telling the story, I remember I told the story the other day on the stage and people looked at me a little strange, like people in Africa don't wear shoes. What are you saying? It's a little strange. And it's amazing how culture changes. Back in the 80s, it was common to tell stories using other people, other races, other continents, but whatever, that's a different conversation. The point is, you can see what I'm saying or what Bob Harris says with that story, which is the mindset. One guy says, nobody here wears shoes, therefore we're not going to be able to sell any. The other guy says, nobody here has any shoes, we're going to sell a ton. You see, the mindset, how we see things, how we think. This has nothing to do with sales training. This has nothing to do with telling people how to make a phone call, what to say, or how to explain the properties of the shoes and so forth. So the same thing applies to weight loss, prosperity, and all kinds of things. Something will happen, and depending on your mindset, you might see an opportunity or an impediment to your dreams. Do you see the power of mindset and inner game stuff? This is how we create amazing results for people. Finally, I'll tell you another story. And this is how I discovered that I could do this work. The year was 1997. I started doing hypnotherapy in 1996. In 97, and I'll never forget this because I've talked about this case many, many times and have good notes on it, but a couple comes in to see me for a marital type of problem. They were having problems getting along and they wanted to see if I could help them with hypnosis, which I did. Soon after we started talking, 1 or 2 sessions later, it became apparent that part of the problem was that the husband wasn't making enough money by the wife's standard. She worked many hours, whatever, and he was a taxi driver, true story. Back then, remember taxis, so he worked mostly around the airport, which meant that he sat around most of the day waiting for a ride. There would be this long line of taxi cabs, and he would be inching his car forward, until eventually he would get a ride and maybe drive for an hour or 2, and then he would be waiting in line another 6 hours, that kind of thing. So he told me that he worked 80 hours a week, right, 2 shifts, and made, at the time, he told me $15,000, a true story, the way, and we talked about his life, his mindset, his upbringing, all kinds of things, and plus a ton of hypnosis. And we finished working. The marriage was restored by their assessment. Everything was fine. They were happy, whatever. About 6 months afterwards, he comes in to see me and he says, look, I want to tell you what happened. I now have 4 cars on the road. And I went from being a taxi driver to essentially an entrepreneur. I got these cars and I lease them and I and I rent them to other drivers, and these 4 cars are being driven 24/7 by different people, and we have to pay the car and the medallion, the license, and a few other things, and the fuel and that kind of thing. But I keep a little bit of money from each, and because of that, I've been able to double my income. So in 6 months, this man was able to do things quite differently and double his income. Do you know how many times I told him to go get more cars and hire drivers? Zero. I never even knew about that possibility. See, outer game of business versus inner game. He knew all about the taxi business because he was a taxi driver. I didn't. The outer game was his domain, but the inner game is what I was able to, thank God, help him with and unleash the potential for him and his family. That's what I mean by inner game. That's what I mean by mindset. And that's why you deserve it as well.